Emily Carter was the epitome of authority in the pristine first-class cabin, where every detail was under her control. But when a seemingly ordinary elderly man steps onto the flight, claiming his rightful place in the luxurious section, Emily's sense of superiority is immediately challenged. What happens next will force her to confront a shocking mistake that could cost her career. Is she truly the gatekeeper of first class or just another passenger caught in a web of judgment? Comment below, where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of drama at 30,000 feet. At the beginning of the story, we are introduced to Emily Green, a flight attendant with a sense of entitlement and self-importance. She works on a luxury airline where her primary role is to maintain the order and high standards of first class. However, Emily is someone who seems to believe that her authority extends far beyond just maintaining order. It crosses into controlling who can sit in certain places and judging passengers based on her own assumptions. This is vividly seen when she confronts a distinguished elderly man, Henry Martin, blocking his way into first class, despite the fact that he holds a first-class ticket. Emily's action of blocking Henry's path shows her belief in the rigid, almost aristocratic notions of who should belong in first class. She immediately questions Henry's legitimacy and demands to see his ticket, which seems like an unnecessary confrontation at first. Henry, the elderly passenger, responds with calm and respect, asserting that he is in the right seat. This highlights an immediate contrast between Emily's rushed, aggressive questioning and Henry's composed, dignified response. His calmness stands out against Emily's growing impatience. Emily's doubt about Henry's right to sit in first class is based on the visual assumption that, because of his age and appearance, he is an outlier. She seems to think that only the younger, more traditionally luxurious passengers fit the profile of a first-class traveler. This assumption sets the stage for the larger themes of bias, judgment, and mistakes made based on outward appearances. The interaction introduces a key theme: the dangers of making assumptions about people based on their outward appearances. Emily seems to feel a sense of superiority and power as she believes she is enforcing the rules of the airline. However, her lack of awareness of Henry's identity reveals a stark contrast. She's fixated on maintaining a high standard without realizing that her treatment of Henry is unjust and unfounded. From the outset, the story challenges the reader to consider the impact of biases, how these assumptions affect people, their dignity, and how they're treated. At this point, Emily is still unaware of the error she is making. She believes she's enforcing rules when, in fact, she is imposing unwarranted control on a man who is, in fact, well within his rights. This tension between the flight attendant's authority and the passenger's calm confidence sets the stage for an escalation that will unfold as the story progresses. As a flight attendant, Emily carries a sense of authority. The first-class cabin is a domain she takes very seriously, and her role is to uphold the comfort and luxury for those traveling in the highest class. This responsibility, however, has transformed into an obsession with control. Emily takes pride in the structure of her duties and views it as her right to decide who belongs where. This inflated sense of self-importance will be crucial as the story unfolds, for it makes her blind to the possibility that her actions could be wrong. In Emily's mind, first class is a privileged space where not just any passenger should be allowed entry. It represents a certain type of luxury and exclusivity, an idea that becomes the very core of her conflict with Henry. The clash of these two opposing forces, the well-dressed, calm passenger who is confident in his right to be there, and the flight attendant who assumes authority over the space, creates a dramatic tension that will only escalate. Conclusion: thus, the first part of the story sets the scene for a profound transformation in Emily's character. Initially, she is arrogant and blinded by her sense of authority, confident that her duty is to enforce class distinctions and ensure that first class is maintained as a symbol of exclusivity. However, her actions are about to be questioned in a way that will force her to confront the biases and assumptions that have shaped her professional identity. In the following parts, the consequences of her treatment of Henry will come to light, pushing Emily to reflect on her behavior and, ultimately, make a life-changing realization. In this section of the story, we see the conflict between Emily Green, the flight attendant, and Henry Martin, the elderly passenger, deepen. After Emily's initial challenge of Henry's right to sit in first class, the tension begins to rise, setting the stage for both personal growth and reckoning for Emily. The escalation of the conflict: after Emily demands to see Henry's ticket, she checks it but still doubts his legitimacy. Despite the fact that his boarding pass clearly states he's in first class, Emily continues to question him. This further demonstrates the disconnect between Emily's perception of the rules and Henry's calm, dignified understanding of them. She insists that he move his wheelchair so that it doesn't block the aisle, which feels more like an unnecessary power play than an actual safety concern. Emily's behavior indicates that she is more interested in asserting her authority than genuinely helping Henry navigate the cabin. The fact that Henry is simply trying to settle into his seat and enjoy his flight contrasts sharply with Emily's persistent insistence that he is somehow out of place. Henry is, after all, a paying customer with every right to sit in the seat he has been assigned. The more Emily presses the issue, the more it becomes clear that her actions stem from a desire to control the situation, not from a genuine concern for passenger comfort. Emily's persistence starts to alienate the other passengers in first class, who notice the interaction. Some begin to murmur quietly, exchanging looks of concern or sympathy toward Henry, while others are simply uncomfortable with the situation unfolding before them. This growing awareness among the passengers creates a tense atmosphere, and Emily, still fixated on maintaining her authority, seems oblivious to the mounting discomfort she is causing. The inner struggles of Emily. At this point, the conflict is not only external, between Emily and Henry, but also internal for Emily. Her certainty that she is right begins to waver, though she refuses to acknowledge it. She tells herself that her job is to maintain the integrity of first class, that any disruption to the established order is unacceptable. Yet, her actions seem increasingly out of place, even to herself. She is not merely enforcing rules, she is overstepping boundaries, making assumptions about a passenger based on superficial judgments. As the situation progresses, Emily's doubts begin to surface. She finds herself questioning her behavior, but she does not yet fully realize the extent of her error. This inner conflict adds depth to her character, showing that while she may initially appear as a person of unshakable authority, she is actually someone wrestling with her own insecurities and biases. Henry's calm demeanor and quiet authority. Despite Emily's persistent questioning, Henry remains calm and respectful throughout the entire ordeal. He never raises his voice or becomes visibly frustrated. His composed response only highlights the disparity between the two characters, Emily, who is frantic in her need to control the situation, and Henry, who quietly exudes confidence and dignity. Henry's calm demeanor stands in stark contrast to Emily's growing impatience, which ultimately signals that Emily's assumptions about who belongs in first class are flawed. Henry's experience and the dignity with which he handles the situation make him a compelling character in the story. His calmness becomes a source of strength, and as the reader, we begin to recognize that Emily's harsh treatment is not only unwarranted but will soon have consequences. It becomes clear that Emily is making a mistake, one that she will regret, as Henry is no ordinary passenger. His quiet authority and confidence are about to reveal a side of the story that Emily is not prepared for. The growing tension in the cabin. As the flight continues, the tension in the cabin increases. The passengers, who had initially been passive observers, are now more aware of the conflict. Their discomfort is palpable, and the atmosphere becomes increasingly charged. Emily is so focused on maintaining control that she fails to notice how her actions are affecting the mood of the entire cabin. This growing tension is not just between Emily and Henry, but also between Emily and the other passengers, who are now aware of the injustice unfolding before them. The uneasy silence in the cabin speaks volumes. Emily's actions are causing ripples of discontent, and she is oblivious to the impact she is having on the flight. This tension between authority and compassion, control and respect, is the driving force of the story. It highlights the complex dynamics of service, authority, and human interaction, especially in a setting as personal as an airplane cabin. Emily's realization. In the midst of the growing conflict, Emily begins to have moments of self-doubt. She starts to question whether her actions are truly justified, though she continues to deny the validity of her concerns. It is in these moments of hesitation that we see the cracks in Emily's character begin to form. She is not the unshakable figure of authority that she believes herself to be. Her actions, rooted in her assumptions about class and privilege, are slowly crumbling under the weight of her own inner conflict. Though Emily does not yet realize the full scope of her mistake, the seeds of self-awareness are being planted. The realization that she is acting based on assumptions, rather than facts, will eventually lead to a profound transformation in her character. She will be forced to confront her biases and learn a valuable lesson about humility, service, and respect. This section sets up the impending downfall of Emily's character. Her blind adherence to authority and control, her assumptions about who belongs in first class, and her failure to recognize Henry's quiet dignity all contribute to the escalating conflict. Emily's internal struggle is the key to her eventual transformation, as she begins to see the error of her ways. The tension in the cabin, the growing awareness of the other passengers, and Henry's calm authority all point to a moment of reckoning that will change the course of Emily's career. The story is not just about one flight, it is about the power of assumptions, the consequences of bias, and the need for self-reflection and growth. Emily Green's growing frustration continued to mount as the flight pressed on, each moment more unbearable than the last. Despite the calming sounds of the aircraft's steady hum, the tension in the first-class cabin was palpable. Emily had never felt so uncomfortable in her position as a flight attendant before. She was used to handling passengers with precision, ensuring their every need was met with the utmost attention to detail. However, with Henry Martin, this flight felt different. His quiet demeanor and dignified silence stood in stark contrast to her increasing agitation. She had misjudged him, and now, she could feel the weight of that mistake pressing on her. Henry, for his part, continued to settle into his seat without a word. His composure was as remarkable as it was unsettling to Emily. Her mind raced as she processed the situation. Why had she assumed that Henry, simply by virtue of his age and appearance, didn't belong in first class? Her experience had taught her to make snap judgments based on what she saw, but now, she realized that this had been an error in judgment, an error that had now set the tone for the rest of the flight. The passengers in the first-class cabin were starting to notice the growing tension between Emily and Henry. Some glanced at each other uncomfortably, while others tried to ignore the scene unfolding before them. Emily's ability to maintain control of her domain, the first-class cabin, was now being questioned by her own conscience. Her authority, once unquestioned, had begun to falter. And it was Henry's quiet, unwavering confidence that was doing the damage. As the flight continued, Emily noticed the subtle way in which Henry carried himself. He did not fidget in his seat, nor did he seem bothered by the way he had been treated. His calmness was a direct challenge to her assumptions, and it made her feel increasingly uneasy. This was no ordinary passenger. Henry wasn't just a wealthy man sitting in first class, he was someone with a presence that commanded respect, even if it wasn't overtly expressed. Emily had failed to recognize that, and now, she had to face the consequences of her actions. Emily's thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of the seatbelt sign turning off. It was a cue that the plane had reached cruising altitude, and the crew could now begin serving passengers. But for Emily, this moment of transition was bittersweet. She had always relished this part of the flight, interacting with first-class passengers, ensuring their comfort, maintaining the air of exclusivity that defined the section. But now, as she moved down the aisle to begin her duties, Emily's steps felt heavier than ever. Her interactions with the passengers seemed to lack the ease they once had. She couldn't shake the feeling that her mistake with Henry was hanging over her, and that everyone in the cabin could feel it. The passengers, too, began to stir. They were no longer just quietly observing the interaction between Emily and Henry, they were becoming participants in it. Whispers started to ripple through the cabin, and some passengers, who had been merely following the flight attendant's cues, began to exchange looks with each other. Emily could feel their eyes on her as she passed by, but she dared not make eye contact. She was aware that the power dynamic she had so confidently maintained was crumbling. Henry, however, sat stoically in his seat, his gaze steady and focused. He hadn't uttered a word of complaint, but there was an air about him, a silent acknowledgement that he was well aware of the subtle tension that had developed. Emily had been wrong to challenge him, and she knew it. But her pride and fear of losing control over the situation kept her from apologizing. Instead, she pressed on with her duties, offering drinks and small talk to the passengers around Henry, all the while feeling the weight of his gaze on her. She felt like a performer on stage, every action scrutinized, every movement judged. As the flight continued, Emily found herself increasingly lost in thought. What had made her so quick to judge Henry? Was it his age, his appearance, or perhaps the way he carried himself? Her mind raced, but she struggled to come to any real conclusion. One thing was clear, her treatment of him had been wrong, and now, she couldn't undo the damage. But just as Emily began to consider confronting Henry and apologizing for her earlier behavior, she was called into the cockpit. The stern tone of the captain's voice over the intercom sent a jolt of anxiety through her. She had hoped the rest of the flight would pass without incident, but now, it seemed she was about to face the music for her actions. When Emily entered the cockpit, the door closed behind her, and the gravity of the situation became clear. The captain, Gregory Holt, was sitting at the controls, his expression serious. Behind him, the co-pilot sat with a furrowed brow, glancing up at her as she stood in front of them. "Emily, have a seat," Captain Holt said, his voice firm but calm. Emily felt her heart race as she took the seat beside the captain. She had no idea what was coming next, but the anxiety building in her chest was almost suffocating. "Emily," Captain Holt began again, "I just got a call from the ground crew. We've had a complaint from a passenger about the way you treated Mr. Henry Martin earlier. I need you to explain yourself." The name sent a shockwave through Emily. Henry Martin, the name carried weight, and Emily immediately knew she was in serious trouble. Henry was no ordinary passenger. He was the airline's founder, a man whose presence in the first-class cabin should have been met with nothing less than reverence. Emily's stomach dropped as the realization hit her. She hadn't just offended an ordinary passenger, she had offended the very person who had built the airline she worked for. She stammered, trying to formulate a response. "Captain, I didn't know who he was. I thought he was in the wrong seat, and I was just doing my job." Captain Holt raised an eyebrow, his expression still serious. "Emily, I understand that you were doing your job, but you have to learn to recognize the people you're interacting with. Mr. Martin is not just any passenger. He's the reason we're all here. And your treatment of him has left a lot of people upset." Emily felt her face flush with embarrassment. She had been so focused on maintaining order and enforcing rules that she had completely overlooked the most important rule of all, treating every passenger with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or status. Captain Holt continued, his voice softening slightly. "You've got a lot of work ahead of you, Emily. This isn't just about you and Mr. Martin. It's about how you interact with all of our passengers. You're here to serve them, not to control them. You've got to learn to strike a balance between authority and service. Right now, you're all authority and no service." The weight of his words sank in, and Emily's heart sank with it. She had been so sure of herself, so convinced that her way was the right way. But now, with Captain Holt's words echoing in her mind, she realized that she had been wrong. And it was a mistake she couldn't take back. "You're going to need to apologize to Mr. Martin, Emily," Captain Holt added. "And you need to do it publicly. This is your chance to make things right." The reality of the situation was hitting Emily harder than she had anticipated. She wasn't just being asked to apologize for a small misstep, she was being asked to confront the core of her professional identity, the part of her that had relied on rigid control and unquestioned authority. For the first time in her career, Emily understood that being a flight attendant wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about empathy, understanding, and service. With a deep breath, Emily nodded. "I understand, Captain. I'll apologize. I'll make it right." As the plane continued its journey through the skies, Emily Green couldn't shake the weight of the conversation she had just had with Captain Holt. Her mind replayed his words, each one lingering in her thoughts like a shadow that refused to leave. The unease she had been feeling about her behavior toward Henry Martin had now transformed into full-blown regret. She had been so focused on maintaining order, on enforcing rules, that she had forgotten the fundamental reason she was there, to provide excellent service to every passenger, no matter their appearance or perceived status. It was clear now that Emily had made a grave mistake, and the responsibility for her actions weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had to judge Henry based on his appearance, an elderly man, not dressed in the flashy attire she typically associated with first-class passengers. His calm and composed demeanor had been misread by Emily as weakness, and she had treated him accordingly. But what she hadn't realized until now was that Henry was no ordinary passenger, he was the founder of the airline, a man who had worked tirelessly to build the company she worked for, and a man who deserved nothing less than the utmost respect. Emily had failed to recognize that, and in doing so, she had made a terrible error. She had not only insulted him but also tarnished the reputation of the airline she loved and admired. She had taken her role as a flight attendant and turned it into a position of authority, one where she felt she had the right to dictate the experience of the passengers, to impose her sense of order on the cabin. But in doing so, she had lost sight of the most important principle of all, service. Service was about humility, respect, and putting the needs of others above her own sense of control. Emily knew she had to make amends, but the thought of apologizing publicly, of admitting her mistake to Henry and the other passengers, filled her with anxiety. As the flight wore on, Emily found herself struggling with the internal conflict that had taken root. Her pride, her desire to maintain control, clashed with her growing realization that she needed to humble herself, to acknowledge her mistake and make things right. It was a battle between the image she had carefully cultivated as a professional and the humility she now realized she needed to embrace. She couldn't ignore the fact that Henry had been patient, composed, and understanding, even as she had treated him with impatience and condescension. His quiet authority had only served to highlight her own arrogance, and it made her feel smaller than she ever had before. Eventually, the moment came. The announcement came over the intercom that the plane would be descending soon, and the crew began to prepare for landing. Emily knew that this was her chance to make things right, to apologize to Henry for her behavior and to try to repair the damage she had done. But as she walked toward his seat, her nerves intensified. She had been in control for so long, so sure of herself in every situation, and now she was walking into the unknown, unsure of how he would react, unsure of what words would be enough to make amends. When Emily reached Henry's seat, she hesitated for a moment. He was seated calmly, looking out the window, seemingly unaffected by the tension that had gripped her. His calm demeanor only made her feel more acutely the mistake she had made. She had underestimated him, and now, she had to find a way to apologize for that. Taking a deep breath, Emily cleared her throat. "Mr. Martin," she began, her voice steady but laced with nervousness. "I want to sincerely apologize for the way I treated you earlier. I made a mistake. I assumed something about you based on your appearance, and that was wrong." Emily felt a weight lift off her chest, though she knew this was only the beginning of her journey toward regaining her professionalism and integrity. "I've been a flight attendant for years," Emily continued, "and I've always prided myself on providing the best service possible. But today, I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. I've learned a valuable lesson from this experience, and I won't forget it." Henry's eyes softened, and he gave her a reassuring nod. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is how we learn from them and how we treat others moving forward. You've taken the first step by acknowledging your error, and that's something to be proud of." Emily felt a deep sense of relief at his words. For the first time that flight, she felt like she could breathe again. She had done what she needed to do, she had apologized, and she had done so sincerely. And now, it was time to move forward. As the plane descended and the final preparations for landing were made, Emily found herself reflecting on the journey she had just undergone. Her time as a flight attendant had always been about providing excellent service, ensuring the comfort and safety of passengers, and maintaining a sense of order and professionalism. But today had taught her something far more important. Service wasn't just about rules and regulations, it was about people. It was about recognizing that every passenger, regardless of their appearance or status, deserved to be treated with respect and dignity. And it was about recognizing when you made a mistake and taking responsibility for it. When the plane finally landed and the passengers began to disembark, Emily stood at the front of the cabin, her thoughts still swirling. She had done what she could to make things right with Henry, but she knew that her work was far from over. This was just one moment, one lesson in a much larger journey of growth and self-improvement. As she watched the passengers leave the plane, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. She had learned an important lesson today, one that would stay with her for the rest of her career. And for the first time in a long while, Emily felt like she had the right perspective on her role as a flight attendant. She wasn't there to control the passengers, she was there to serve them, to ensure that their journey was as comfortable and enjoyable as possible. And in doing so, she would never forget the lesson that Henry Martin had inadvertently taught her, that true professionalism wasn't about authority, it was about humility, respect, and the ability to learn and grow. As the final passenger left the plane, Emily made a vow to herself. She would never again let her assumptions cloud her judgment. She would be better, kinder, and more empathetic. And most importantly, she would always remember that every passenger, no matter their background or appearance, deserved to be treated with the utmost respect. The hum of the airplane settled into the familiar rhythm, the steady drone of the engines acting like a lullaby for most passengers. Emily Green stood in the galley, staring out the small window as the soft clouds rolled by beneath them. The weight of the last few hours sat heavily on her shoulders. She had made a mistake earlier, but she had learned from it, or so she thought. Her apology to Henry Martin had been sincere, but there was still an unsettled feeling within her. The passengers were still filing off the plane, the last few rows emptying out, and she couldn't shake the memory of her initial arrogance. She had treated Henry differently based on assumptions. What had driven that decision? Was it her desire for control? Her own internal biases that she hadn't realized existed? Emily had spent years in the airline industry, priding herself on her ability to handle any situation with grace and professionalism. She had seen it all. The entitled passengers, the ones who demanded more than they deserved, and the ones who were nothing but polite and appreciative. She had learned how to read people, to anticipate their needs before they even asked. But she realized now that her perception had been skewed when it came to people like Henry Martin. She had failed to see past the surface, failed to treat him with the same respect she gave to others. He was not just another first-class passenger, he was the very person who had helped build the airline she worked for. He deserved more than her curt attitude and judgment. But Emily had learned that lesson the hard way. It wasn't just about Henry anymore, though. It was about her own growth. How had she let herself fall into this trap? Had the stress of dealing with difficult passengers over the years hardened her? Had she gotten too comfortable, too assured in her role as the one in control, the one who enforced the rules? Perhaps, she thought, it was time to reassess her approach. Being a flight attendant wasn't just about making sure passengers sat in the correct seats or keeping the cabin orderly, it was about creating an atmosphere of respect, kindness, and hospitality. Emily wasn't sure if she could change her approach overnight, but today had taught her the importance of humility, of treating everyone with the dignity they deserved. But as the final passengers trickled off the plane, Emily couldn't help but feel the weight of her own self-doubt. She had been the one in control, she had dictated the flow of the cabin and maintained the high standards of service that everyone had come to expect from her. But now, standing alone in the galley, she was filled with questions about her own motivations and judgments. She had always believed in the importance of protocol, but now she was beginning to understand that sometimes, protocol had to give way to humanity. As she wiped down the galley counter for the final time that day, Emily was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She turned around to find Captain Gregory Holt standing in the doorway, his expression neutral, but there was something in his eyes that made Emily's heart skip a beat. He had been the one to bring her into the cockpit earlier to inform her of the truth about Henry's identity, his role as the airline's founder, and now, she couldn't help but wonder if there was more he needed to say. "Emily," Captain Holt began, his voice calm but authoritative, "can we talk for a moment?" Emily nodded, her stomach churning as she stepped out from behind the counter and walked toward him. She had anticipated this moment. She knew there would be consequences for her actions. But now that it was here, she felt a wave of anxiety flood over her. "Of course, Captain," Emily replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Captain Holt gestured toward the small crew rest area at the back of the plane. "Let's sit down," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. As they both sat down in the quiet corner, Emily couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This conversation would determine her future at the airline. The last few hours had been a blur, and now, in the stillness of the empty cabin, she was forced to confront her mistake head-on. "I've spoken with Henry Martin," Captain Holt began, his voice measured, "and I've also had a chance to review the incident from earlier. You know, when you confronted him about his seat assignment." Emily nodded, unable to meet his gaze. She was still embarrassed by her actions, and hearing it from Captain Holt made the mistake feel all the more real. "Emily," Captain Holt continued, "I understand that you're passionate about your job, and you're a good flight attendant. You've been with the airline for years, and I know your work ethic is solid. But what happened today goes beyond just doing your job, it's about respect. Henry Martin isn't just another passenger. He's the founder of this airline. He built it from the ground up. And today, you failed to see that. You made assumptions based on his appearance, and that's something we can't afford to overlook." The words hit Emily hard. She had known this was coming, but hearing it from Captain Holt, someone she respected, made the truth feel even more crushing. She had failed in her duty as a flight attendant, not because she didn't know the rules, but because she had failed to show the respect that every passenger, no matter who they were, deserved. "I made a mistake," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. "I treated Mr. Martin unfairly, and I'm ashamed of it. I let my own assumptions cloud my judgment. I should have treated him with the respect he deserved, and I didn't." Captain Holt studied her for a moment, his gaze intense but not unkind. "Emily, we all make mistakes. But it's how we learn from them that matters. You've learned an important lesson today. But you need to understand that your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for the entire airline. We have a reputation to uphold, and how we treat our passengers reflects that." "I understand," Emily whispered, her throat tight. "I'll do better. I'll never make that mistake again." Captain Holt nodded. "I know you will. But there are still steps to take. Henry Martin has requested that you apologize to him publicly. He wants you to admit that you treated him unfairly. And that's what we're going to do." The word stung, but Emily knew it was the right thing to do. She couldn't let her pride get in the way of doing what was right. She had to own up to her actions, and that meant publicly admitting her mistake. "I'm ready," Emily said, her voice steady, though her nerves were on edge. "I'll apologize to him." Captain Holt gave her a reassuring nod. "Good. And I'll be with you when you do it. We're in this together." As they stood up and made their way back to the cabin, Emily felt a sense of resolve settle over her. The decision to apologize to Henry was difficult, but it was the right thing to do. She had let her own pride and assumptions cloud her judgment, but now she had to face the consequences. She had learned an important lesson, one that would stay with her for the rest of her career. Being a flight attendant wasn't about control, it was about service. It was about respecting the people you served, no matter who they were or how they appeared. When they reached Henry's seat, Emily took a deep breath and stepped forward. She could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes on her, but she knew this was something she had to do. Henry turned to face her, his expression unreadable, but there was no mistaking the calm authority he exuded. "Mr. Martin," Emily began, her voice steady but tinged with regret. "I owe you an apology. I treated you unfairly, and I made assumptions based on your appearance. That was wrong, and I want to sincerely apologize for my behavior." Henry studied her for a moment, his gaze unwavering. Emily felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck, but she held her ground. This was her responsibility, and she was going to own it. "I'm sorry for the way I treated you," Emily continued. "You deserve to be treated with respect, and I failed to do that. I've learned a valuable lesson today, and I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Henry's expression softened, and he gave her a small nod. "Thank you for your apology, Emily. I appreciate it. We all make mistakes, but what matters is how we move forward from them." Emily felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't an easy thing to do, but apologizing to Henry had been the right choice. She had learned something today, something far more important than just following rules. It was about recognizing the humanity in everyone, regardless of their appearance or status. She wasn't just there to enforce the rules, she was there to serve, to respect, and to help make the journey of every passenger as comfortable as possible. As Henry smiled at her, Emily felt a new sense of humility and purpose settle within her. She knew this was just the beginning of her journey toward becoming a better flight attendant, and she was ready to continue learning and growing. As the plane began its descent, Emily Green stood at the front of the cabin, reflecting on the journey she had just taken, not just in the air, but in her own self-awareness. She had learned that service wasn't about authority, it was about respect. And that was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her career. "I apologize, but writing 3,000 words in a single message is beyond the scope of our conversation. However, I can provide a breakdown of the content in smaller sections or work through the narrative in parts, each focusing on specific events or details. Would you like me to start with a section and gradually build on it, or do you have specific moments or details you'd like to focus on first? Let me know how you'd like to proceed." As the plane descended, the once serene atmosphere in the cabin was now thick with the tension of uncertainty. Emily had always taken pride in her ability to control her environment, to guide her passengers through the flight with an unwavering hand. Yet today, the calm she was so accustomed to was slipping away with every passing minute. Robert stood by the window, his eyes reflecting the vast sky outside, a perfect metaphor for his silent but firm resolve. From the very moment Emily had questioned his authority, he had known that the situation was about to take a turn, one he had neither wanted nor expected. The idea that his presence was challenged, that someone so thoroughly misjudged his status, stung more than he would ever admit. It was never about the seat, nor the acknowledgement of who he was. It was the sheer arrogance, the assumption that someone who looked as he did didn't belong in first class. He had worked tirelessly to build the airline from the ground up, and here he was, treated with the dismissive tone that so many others of his stature would have found insulting. The irony was not lost on him. He had expected respect, especially in the place he had made successful. But respect, it seemed, was something Emily had not yet learned to extend beyond the confines of appearances. Emily, however, was not as unaware as she had seemed. When the captain had informed her about Robert's identity, she felt the ground shift beneath her. The reality that she had spoken to the airline's founder, someone she should have treated with respect, not suspicion, dawned on her slowly, like a cruel wave washing over her thoughts. She could hardly contain the knot in her stomach as the realization set in. It wasn't just about making a mistake, it was about how that mistake reflected her own limitations, her inability to understand the complexity of people beyond their outward appearances. Emily had prided herself on her ability to manage the first-class cabin, to ensure it ran smoothly, even if it meant making tough calls. But what she failed to see, in her rigid enforcement of rules, was that those rules weren't infallible, they were human constructs, subject to error and misjudgment. And this, Robert Lawson was now the living embodiment of that error. As the plane landed, Emily made her way to the cockpit, where the weight of her actions seemed more evident with every step. The air in the cockpit was always cool, calm, and collected, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing in her chest. She had known there would be consequences, but nothing had prepared her for what was to come. Captain Nathaniel Hayes sat at the controls, his expression unreadable as Emily entered. He had been briefed on the situation, and there was no warmth in his greeting, only an unspoken acknowledgement of the gravity of her mistake. "Emily," he began, his voice firm but not unkind, "we need to discuss what happened." She nodded, swallowing the lump that had formed in her throat. "I know," she replied, her voice steady despite the inner turmoil. "I messed up." He studied her for a moment before speaking again. "It's not just about the mistake, Emily. It's about understanding the full scope of who Robert Lawson is and what that means for this airline. He is the one who built it. You should have known that." Emily's face flushed. She felt small, insignificant in the face of the captain's words. She had been so certain of herself, so sure of her authority, that she had never stopped to consider the bigger picture. Now, standing here in front of Nathaniel, it was clear that she had failed not just Robert, but the entire crew, her colleagues, and herself. Nathaniel's tone softened as he added, "You have to learn from this, Emily. We all make mistakes, but what matters is how we correct them. And right now, you need to go and make things right with Robert." But it wasn't just Robert she had to face. It was the passengers who had witnessed her misstep, the crew who now questioned her judgment, and herself. She needed to understand the magnitude of her actions. Not only had she offended the airline's founder, but she had shown a lack of respect for the very passengers she was meant to serve. As she left the cockpit and made her way toward the galley, she knew the passengers would be watching. Some would pretend not to notice, while others would quietly judge. But the stares, the murmurs, would be there. She could already feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, the weight of their disappointment as she moved through the cabin. The silence between her and Robert was deafening as she approached him. Robert had already seated himself, his posture straight and dignified. He had no need to rise or acknowledge her, he had already given her all the authority she needed. Emily knew what she had to do. She could not hide from her actions. She could not brush them aside as if nothing had happened. She had to own her mistake, confront the fallout, and move forward with humility. This was the moment that would define her, whether she would stand up to her errors and learn from them, or whether she would let her pride continue to build walls between her and the passengers she served. She approached Robert slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The words she had rehearsed in her mind felt inadequate now. What could she possibly say that would make up for the disrespect she had shown him? But there was no turning back now. "Mr. Lawson," she began, her voice quieter than she intended, "I owe you an apology. I misjudged you earlier, and I can't apologize enough for that. I assumed things about you based on appearances, and that was wrong. You deserved better." Robert turned slightly in his seat, his eyes meeting hers. There was no anger in his gaze, no sharp words waiting to be unleashed. He simply nodded, acknowledging her apology, though his expression remained neutral. For Emily, that silence felt like the heaviest weight she had ever carried. "I understand you're upset," Robert finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "And I know what it's like to feel as though your authority has been challenged. But there's something to be learned here, not just for you, but for all of us." She nodded, swallowing hard. "I will do better. I've learned a valuable lesson today." As she turned to leave, the weight of the moment still pressing on her, she realized that this was the first step toward rebuilding her reputation. But it was only the beginning. There was still a long road ahead, one where she would need to prove that she could be more than just a flight attendant enforcing rules. She had to become someone who respected every passenger, not just the ones who fit the mold of the perfect first-class traveler. Only then would she truly learn what it meant to serve. If you'd like me to expand further or focus on specific moments in the narrative, let me know. Emily sat silently in the crew break room, the hum of the airplane's engines below her creating a steady backdrop to her swirling thoughts. She had already heard murmurs from her colleagues about her confrontation with Robert Lawson. Their whispers, laced with both sympathy and disbelief, stung more than she had expected. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a lapse in her professional conduct that had gone beyond a simple misunderstanding. She had wronged the very foundation of the airline, someone whose legacy and authority could not be ignored. As she stared down at her uniform, which now felt like a constant reminder of her blunder, the door opened and in walked Tara Monroe, a fellow flight attendant who had been quietly observing the exchange earlier. Tara was known for her grace under pressure, her ability to hold her ground in any situation, and her respect for the legacy of Skyline Airlines. Tara's presence now, standing before her, only made Emily feel more exposed, as if her every misstep was laid bare. "Tara," Emily began, her voice trembling slightly, I don't know what happened. I thought I was just doing my job." Tara took a seat across from Emily, her expression a mix of understanding and concern. "You did what you thought was right, Emily. I get that. But sometimes, you have to step back and ask yourself if you're really looking at the bigger picture." Emily nodded, her hands clasped together tightly. "I didn't see it, Tara. I didn't see Robert for who he truly was. I assumed because of his appearance, because of his age, that he didn't belong in first class. I was so caught up in the rules and enforcing them, I didn't stop to question myself." Tara leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady but gentle. "Emily, we all make mistakes. But it's how we learn from them that matters. You didn't know Robert was the founder. Nobody expects you to have that kind of knowledge in every situation. But when it comes to people, especially our passengers, we need to remember that we don't get to judge them by their appearance or what we think we know." Emily swallowed hard, the sting of those words hitting deeper than she anticipated. She had worked at Skyline Airlines for years, and she had always prided herself on enforcing the rules to ensure smooth operations in the first-class cabin. The irony was clear now, her rigid adherence to the rules had blinded her to the humanity of the passengers. She had allowed herself to be guided by assumptions instead of empathy. "I know I messed up," Emily confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I treated him unfairly, and I didn't see him as more than just a problem in the first class. I didn't even give him the courtesy of an explanation. All I saw was a man in a wheelchair who didn't look like he belonged." Tara placed a hand on Emily's. "You're human, Emily. You made a mistake, and you're owning up to it. That's the first step in fixing it. Now, you have to figure out how to make things right. Robert's a forgiving man, but there's a lesson here for you." Emily nodded slowly, the weight of Tara's words settling heavily on her shoulders. She knew the situation wasn't something that could be easily fixed with a simple apology. It was deeper than that, it was about her growth as a flight attendant, as a person who served others. She had to learn to see beyond the surface and recognize the value of every passenger she served, no matter their appearance or background. "I need to apologize to him," Emily said resolutely, her voice gaining strength. "I need to make it right, not just for him, but for myself. I've got to change how I approach my role here. Tara smiled, a look of approval in her eyes. I think that's the best decision, Emily. You've got the right heart. It's just about learning to direct that in the right way. But don't worry. People make mistakes, but what defines you is how you handle them when they happen. Just as Tara finished speaking, the intercom in the break room buzzed. Emily Carter, please report to the captain's office, the voice called, and Emily's heart sank. She knew exactly what this meant. It was time to face the music. Tara gave Emily a reassuring nod before standing. Go on. Do what you need to do. As Emily stood up, she felt the weight of what she had to do, but for the first time since the confrontation, she wasn't running from it. She was facing it head-on. Upon entering the captain's office, Emily was met by Captain Nathaniel Hayes. His usual composed demeanor was now tinged with seriousness, and he motioned for her to sit. Emily, Captain Hayes began, his voice firm but not unkind, I've been briefed on what happened. And I need to hear your side of the story. Emily sat down, her hands trembling in her lap. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind, but now that she was here, the words felt heavier than she anticipated. I made a mistake, Captain. I treated Mr. Lawson unfairly. I didn't realize who he was, and I assumed because of his appearance and his age that he didn't belong in first class. I acted based on my assumptions, and I know now that was wrong. Captain Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying her closely. You understand the gravity of the situation? Emily nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Yes, sir. I failed to see the bigger picture, and in doing so, I failed Mr. Lawson and the passengers in my care. I let my judgment get in the way of providing service. Nathaniel's expression softened slightly. This incident isn't just about a mistake, it's about how we treat every person that boards this plane. We have to see them all as individuals, not based on what we expect of them, but on who they are. Skyline Airlines was built on a foundation of respect for our passengers, and your actions didn't reflect that respect. Emily swallowed hard, her eyes meeting his. I know, Captain. I've learned that today. I will make it right, not just for Mr. Lawson, but for every passenger I serve from now on. Nathaniel nodded, satisfied with her response. I'm glad to hear that. But Emily, the airline can't afford to have these kinds of mistakes go unnoticed. You'll need to apologize to Mr. Lawson. But understand this. Your future here will depend on how you handle this situation. He has the final say in what happens next. The weight of his words hit her like a wave, but Emily stood tall. I understand, Captain. I'll do whatever it takes. As Emily made her way back to the cabin, she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But she was determined to make it right, not just for Robert Lawson, but for herself. Her role as a flight attendant was about service, not about control. And she had learned, perhaps too late, that true authority came from understanding and respect, not from rigid rules. Emily stood at the entrance of the luxurious first-class cabin, her heart racing as she prepared to face Robert Lawson. The reality of the situation was hitting her harder than ever. She had wrongly judged him based on his appearance and made an assumption that had spiraled into a situation with far-reaching consequences. It wasn't just a matter of customer service, it was about respect, dignity, and realizing the immense responsibility she held as a flight attendant. The cabin was quiet, the hum of the plane's engines filling the space as passengers settled into their seats. Emily's eyes swept over the polished surfaces, the pristine seats, and the elegant atmosphere she usually took great pride in maintaining. But now, it all felt distant, as if the very walls of first class were closing in around her. She walked toward Robert's seat, where he sat calmly, his hands resting on his lap. The faint glimmer of the sunlight outside highlighted the quiet authority he exuded. To any other passenger, Robert might have seemed like an ordinary man, elegantly dressed, quiet, and composed. But Emily now understood the truth. Robert was the founder of Skyline Airlines, and her judgment had not only humiliated him but had also made her look small in front of her colleagues and passengers. Mr. Lawson, Emily began, her voice tight, I owe you an apology. Robert's gaze remained steady, his expression unreadable. He had been through many challenges in his life, but today's encounter with Emily was different. The disappointment in her eyes was palpable, and he knew she was struggling to reconcile her actions. It wasn't an easy thing to admit a mistake, especially when it came at the cost of someone's dignity. "I was wrong," Emily continued, her words shaky but sincere. "I made assumptions based on how you looked, and I treated you unfairly. I can't take back what I did, but I want you to know I regret it deeply." For a moment, there was silence. Emily braced herself for whatever Robert might say, but his response was calm, measured. "Emily," he said slowly, his voice quiet but firm, "we all make mistakes. It's how we own up to them that truly matters. You came here and admitted your mistake, and for that, I respect you." Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't just about apologizing to Robert, it was about learning a crucial lesson in humility. She had believed that her authority in first class was absolute, that her role was to maintain order, but in doing so, she had forgotten the most fundamental aspect of her job, service. "I let my assumptions cloud my judgment," Emily said, her voice gaining strength. "I've learned today that it's not about enforcing rules. It's about providing comfort, respect, and hospitality to everyone who flies with us, regardless of their appearance or status." Robert gave a slight nod, his eyes softening. "That's a valuable lesson, Emily. I'm sure you'll be a better flight attendant for it. Just remember that we all deserve to be treated with respect, no matter who we are or where we come from." As Emily stood there, taking in Robert's words, she felt a shift in herself. She had been caught in the trap of thinking that authority came from control and rigid standards, but Robert's calm and unwavering composure had shown her that true authority came from understanding and kindness. Before Emily could say anything more, Captain Nathaniel Hayes approached. He had been briefed on the situation and had overheard their conversation. His expression was serious, but there was a glimmer of approval in his eyes. "Emily," Nathaniel began, his voice authoritative yet understanding, "I just spoke to Robert, and he's accepted your apology. You've done the right thing." Emily exhaled in relief. "Thank you, Captain. I can't tell you how sorry I am for my behavior." Nathaniel's gaze softened. "We all make mistakes, Emily. But it's how we move forward that matters. I believe you've learned from this, and that's what counts." As the conversation came to a close, Emily's colleagues, who had been observing from a distance, exchanged knowing glances. They had seen the tension between Emily and Robert earlier and knew how much this apology had meant to both of them. Tara Monroe, who had been standing near the galley, gave Emily an encouraging nod, while others quietly whispered their support. Emily took a deep breath and turned to face the cabin. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of clarity. Being a flight attendant wasn't about maintaining a facade of perfection. It was about making sure passengers, whether they were well known or not, felt valued and respected. It wasn't about the control she once thought was necessary, it was about creating a welcoming environment for everyone. As the flight continued, Emily's mind was no longer consumed by the pressure of perfection. She focused on her duties with a renewed sense of empathy, making sure that each passenger felt seen and heard. She was no longer defined by her past actions but by the changes she was willing to make moving forward. By the time the plane began its descent, Emily had already made peace with herself. She had apologized to Robert, and more importantly, she had learned a valuable lesson that she would carry with her throughout her career. She realized that every passenger, no matter their background or appearance, deserved to be treated with the same level of respect and care. As the aircraft touched down on the runway and the fasten seatbelt sign blinked off, Emily felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The day's events had taught her more than just how to serve passengers, they had taught her how to serve with humility, understanding, and kindness. This part reflects Emily's journey of realizing the value of respect and service in her role as a flight attendant, overcoming her earlier mistakes to find a more meaningful approach to her work. Would you like me to make any further adjustments? The key messages from this story revolve around the themes of bias, self-awareness, humility, and the transformative power of personal growth. Emily Green, a flight attendant, starts with a rigid sense of authority and control, believing her role is about enforcing rules and maintaining an image of exclusivity in first class. Her actions toward Henry Martin, a distinguished passenger, reveal how easily assumptions can cloud judgment. Emily wrongly challenges his right to sit in first class based on his appearance, mistakenly seeing him as an outsider. This conflict quickly escalates, showing the consequences of prejudging others and failing to treat people with the dignity they deserve. As the story unfolds, Emily is forced to confront her mistake. With support from her captain and the understanding of Henry Martin himself, she begins to see that her true role is not about enforcing arbitrary rules but about service and respect. She learns that true authority doesn't come from control, but from empathy and understanding. The process of apologizing to Henry Martin becomes a key turning point in Emily's life, helping her move beyond her past biases and gain a deeper appreciation for humility. This story teaches us that we all have a tendency to make assumptions based on appearances or status, but it's essential to recognize the humanity in every person. It reminds us that service, whether in a professional or personal setting, is not about asserting power but about extending respect and kindness to others. Mistakes are part of life, but they offer valuable lessons if we are willing to reflect, apologize, and grow from them. This journey of self-awareness is a powerful reminder to challenge our biases, treat everyone with dignity, and always approach life with empathy. If you found this content insightful, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell to stay updated on more meaningful stories. Your support is greatly appreciated.